Hello and welcome to episode 152 of Just Keep Writing,
a podcast for writers.
By writers.
To keep you writing.
I'm Marshall.
I'm Gabe.
I'm Sameem.
I'm RJ.
And I'm Will. And in today's episode, we're going to be talking about plot versus character. But before we get there, let me introduce you to our guest co-host, RJ Taylor. RJ, tell our listeners a little bit about yourself.
Hi, I'm RJ Taylor. I write short stories and novels. That's about it. I'm very excited to be here.
RJ was also on the long list for what award were you long listed for?
The BFA.
Yeah.
BSFA. British Science Fiction.
She has been in multiple publications. She is agented and they're shopping her novel right now. We're very excited. RJ has also been on episode 75 with Gabe and myself and our other cohort, Billy, who's part of our writing group called The Immortals. She's amazing and I'm super excited that you're here.
Yes, we love RJ. Welcome back, RJ. Welcome back. That's good to see you again.
Thanks for having me.
So I wanted to really kind of talk about, we always hear about plot versus character-driven stories. So plot-driven stories, I would say, focus on external events and actions, where character-driven stories focus on inner lives of the characters. I would say that you really need both to create a really compelling book. But for this purpose, we are going to kind of like break it down. So I want to ask the question first, what do each of you start with when you're going about creating your novel or a short story? Is it plot, where it's more action or maybe a magic system that you want to explore or a political system that you think of first? Or is it character-driven, where you have the character come to mind first and then develop a story from there? So I'm going to start off with our fearless leader here, Marshall. You may begin.
So do I start with character or do I start with an idea first? Is that basically what you're asking?
Yeah, like who comes through first? Like, is it the character that comes through to you first? Or are you like, you know what, I have this magic system or I have this idea, or you just read a novel and you're like, that was a really great plot that ran through the book. So how does it usually come to you?
I feel like the latter is more accurate, but usually what I start with random. It kind of depends on how I start the story. So or how I get the idea for the story. So typically, some of my short fiction, especially, start with a random, I was getting ideas from science fiction articles for a while, and just being like, well, what if that did happen? And then I come up with a first line and then I'm like, oh, I need a character. And then it just kind of pops in. So sometimes I come up with it that way. But with longer works, a lot of times it is kind of more of a there's a world I have in mind that I've got to kind of insert characters into. You know what I mean? So with the novel that I wrote, I knew I wanted to write a black space opera, kind of in the vein of Firefly. That was kind of my idea. You know what I mean? And I'm like, well, what kind of characters are compelling to me in that world? But I had already kind of built kind of how I was going to have the characters moving through the world, whether I knew who those characters were or not. So it kind of depends on how the length of the story and how I got the idea in the first place, actually.
Okay, so I have a question for you, because I have read your novel that you got full requested for by 2 agents. Just throwing that out there, everyone.
Just throwing that out there so everybody knows, I guess.
Yep.
Thank you.
Specifically with that, because you are specifically trying to have a black space opera, were there certain themes you knew that you wanted to explore? And did those themes come up through plot, or did those themes come up through you had a character idea of what you wanted this character's journey to be like?
I think the themes in that were more was more based on the world, because I wanted there to be I wanted to envision a near future where, the world had kind of gone to shit. climate change is out of control. We got to figure out how to get out of here, right? But at the same time, I wanted there to be a shift in power at some point. And so the most powerful people, the people with the most wealth, and the people that are instrumental in getting the population off the planet were Black instead of white. And so that was kind of the idea behind that particular story. And so really the characters are just there are Black characters, but they're kind of feeling the repercussions of trying to not necessarily stay in power, but try to hold on to what they have, with others trying to take it away from them. I don't know if that answers your question, but that was specifically for that novel. Yeah.
Like, I think when you're saying that, and everyone can jump in on this point, like when I hear that say that, it seems like it is at first maybe plot driven, because you're thinking of events that are happening. And I think, listen, I'm going to caveat and say this. I think plot versus character is fluid. I do really think you need both for a good story, but sometimes it's like when we create something, it's like, where are we thinking of? So, I can see that being almost like very like thinking about plot first and then thinking about, well, how would these characters interact within this universe with the system that you're creating?
So, and I also might backpedal a little bit on what I said. It's not necessarily plot first. The plot kind of came and it was a very fluid thing. The plot was kind of like, well, I can change this, I can move this, but the characters were a consistent thing. I knew what the crew was going to look like, and I knew what I wanted their backstories to be ahead of time. Mm-hmm. So them moving through the world was really the driving the plot as I outlined. You know what I mean? I think the problem is when I'm talking about this particular book is that I was kind of quote unquote forced to outline it, and I don't normally work that way. I kind of start and then backpedal. And so I definitely had the characters in mind very, very soon once I got the idea.
That's amazing. RJ, same question. Would you like me to repeat it?
No, it's okay. I generally... I keep wanting to be like, I reject your false dichotomy, but I actually start with what I would call like a dynamic image. So when I feel like I'm hooked into a story or even a novel at the point at which I feel like I have had, like, not to get too out there about it, but like have a vision, like I can see a character in motion, and often it like is just kind of a snippet. And then I go back and ask myself, like, who is this character? Like, what are they doing? Like, why are they in this weird situation? What do they want? Like, what are the dynamics around them? What is the world? What is the question going to be throughout this story? That the theme, all those greater questions kind of come out from that. But I start with that image. So, like with All the Little Gods, the novel that's currently on submission, I had this image of a jester, someone in a jester's outfit running along the top of a wall. And I was just like, what is this person running from? Like, and like, that's just like now a tiny, tiny moment in the novel. Like everything, it's like, I could have cut it. Like in other stories, the original vision ended up getting cut, but it's kind of that spark that gets everything going.
That is actually your opening scene, right? Of the
not anymore. in the latest revision, I added some before that.
Yeah, I think what's interesting too about that is like reading your work, especially All the Little Gods, your characterization. I love those characters. I mean, you know all this already. So it's interesting to hear that like you like have a vision of things first and then you go from there. What about your short stories? Does it tend to be like you think of the idea of how you want something to play out, or is it a character that comes through that is speaking to you?
It's similar in that I usually need to feel, I guess another way of putting it is kind of I need to feel a character longing in order to get going. So I kind of have an imagination of a character in a strange situation that's intriguing to me for some reason. So, like in my story, Vanishing Point, there, I had a dream. I've written 2 stories based on dreams now. That only one of them's published though, so far. I had this dream about someone trying to, seeing this alien, this giant alien, and like trying to reach it and not being able to, and this longing of like trying to reach something that's kind of unreachable, and that the rest of the story grew out around that character's specific longing.
Vanishing was in science fiction, the fantasy and science fiction. Vanishing Point, right?
Vanishing Point, yeah.
Yeah, that one's a really great short story. Everyone should read, and we'll link it in the we'll link it in the show notes. And we're actually going to have RJ on for another episode where we actually talk about one of her short stories. So you'll find out more about her then. Gabe, what about you? Do you want me to repeat the question?
No, it's okay. I've been thinking also through the answers of the others, and sometimes, it depends, basically. But I think mostly for short stories, it has been an idea seed. Like the story I'm working right now, which you've read, I watched a YouTube video, the channel Kurzgesagt, about what would happen if the moon... how would it be if the moon crashed into Earth? And I watched the video, and I literally got chilled, like, oh my god, this is such a good concept for a story. So with this one and many other short stories, it has been concept first, but then I immediately jumped to character. Okay, and with the moon falling story, it was the concept, bottle of blood, of course the moon is falling, but then I went to the character because that's the thing that I gravitate most while writing and while reading. So it's from the character, see their, work on their current context, and then, as RJ said, try to figure out what they want. And from that, I build a plot, I guess. And for my novel, it was literally just 2 characters. It was this character, 3 characters. The main character with his sister and his nephew. Literally, that was the origin story for the whole novel. And from there, I started picking things that I like in genre. And I started building everything out from just the characters. I actually first built was the characters, a little of the setting, like what kind of magic system, what kind of technology, the history time in history, and then I started building the plot. So I guess it's mostly that in longer form, I guess. At least that has been my experience. And in short stories, it's first the idea. It's 90% it has been the idea, or a challenge, which we did in a retreat, have this line and from this build the thing.
Yeah. That's interesting considering with your novel, because it is, I would say, epic fantasy, that it is with the characters that you start first. Because I feel like a lot of what I've read from people who write epic fantasy, it tends to be they're really drawn to the magic system. They're really drawn to the world building, which to me, sometimes that means plot driven, right? You're thinking of the plot of what you would want to happen, but with you, it was specifically characters. And I think reading the parts of your novel that we've been able to read, it is interesting to also see that it's your characters, because your characters come across really, really well and very much like a family. Marshall.
I think what's interesting about, because I'm with Gabe on that level, sometimes you come up with an idea, but then you have to have the characters in place before kind of the plot can unfold. And I really feel like I have a hard time developing what is going to happen in the story until I know the characters a little bit, right? So one of my other projects I'm working on is a short story I wrote because I had this random idea. and it was just kind of fun to play with. It was from grad school, and then I'm like, I want to flesh this out. I want this to be more, right? But I had to kind of get to know that character a little bit, and writing that short story helped, but doing some other writing around that character and figuring out what they're about and what motivates them, I think is the big part. So I think that's what is, I think that's what you're saying, Will, when you say like people who write bigger fantasy, like it's hard for me. I have a hard time saying like, I want this, and this to happen, because I have to know who the characters are first and how they plan to move through the world that I've created. I might have an idea for the world, but I cannot come up with the plot until the characters make sense.
Yes, this is definitely where I'm moving towards too.
Okay.
Sameem, was there anything you'd like to add?
I think I mostly agree and have a similar experience to what everyone said. I think I have a really hard time, like RJ said, like drawing the dichotomy, because I feel like for me, it's a conversation between all these elements, between the scenario and the concept and the environment and the characters. And so I think for a minute when we were talking, I was thinking, oh yeah, I'm very concept driven. I come up with a concept and then I come up with a character and then the characters take over and I forget about the concept. But I feel like I don't, when I thought about it more, when I think of the concept, I already know the kind of person who I want to experience that what if. I might not have thought about it very consciously, but it has already happened. So I feel like it's this conversation between all these different elements. And I don't know if there's like any one that really drives it. And there's a conversation that I listened to. There's randomly this really little literary conference in the suburban town that I live in that's named after F. Scott Fitzgerald because he's buried here for some reason, even though he never lived here. And I went to it for the first time a few years ago, and Kim Stanley Robinson and Richard Powers were the guests of honor. And I haven't read Richard Powers' work yet, but I think he's written a lot about like environment and like holistically the environment as character as well. That's what the direction the conversation went in. And they talked a lot about how the postmodern like American novels are very individual focused, whereas stories before and now more recently stories emerging now, especially as there's more international influence and cross-cultural influence. There's more stories where the humans are not separate from the environment; they're one element of it. And so I haven't done any more research than that conversation, but I just thought it was like a really interesting counterpoint to like the dichotomy that we're talking about.
Yes, Gabe.
I'm also thinking that these might be like different conversations in the sense that like we are talking here of the origin, like what drives us to write the stories, what originates the stories versus the actual character-driven story or plot-driven story. I think using the example from a novel, okay, originate from a character, and it is a character-driven story because that's what I gravitate to. So in that sense, they're the same. Like the origin is the same as what drives it later. And in the short story, like it's not concept-driven per se. The story itself later, when people read it, I know it was originated by the concept. But when people read it, the end product, I hope they feel it's character driven. So I mean, just trying to see if that distinction helps the writing process. Or I'm sorry, I have many thoughts bouncing around.
Okay. RJ?
So like you could be inspired by a character, the idea of a character, but then end up writing a thriller that's like very, very 100% plot drives the, why people are turning the page. But it could be that you thought, a particular type of person was you wanted to write about that particular type of character.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking of like the philosophical angle of what originates, what makes a writer write story, and then how it ends.
Where did it all begin?
Yeah, and how the process itself changes a story. Because you might think you want to write this story in a character-driven way, but then the character drives you to a plot that is super interesting, and then you work more on the plot itself, and then it becomes a plot-driven story, or even a setting-driven story. Because, I mean, it's the triangle of setting, plot, character, which I think guess most stories need character and plot. You can have a really good story with a meh setting, but I guess you cannot have a really good one without character and plot.
I mean, I think the thing is that
general,
they are so fluid, but there are some good examples of a plot-driven or concept versus a character-driven, right? So I'm going to kind of talk about that. I think one of them is like Kim Stanley Robinson, who did the Red Mars, Green Mars, and everything there. That, to me, is very much about world building and expanding a concept and then having the characters in there. But I will just say for me, because everyone always wants me to talk, apparently, I would say for me, I think it kind of depends. I think I'm much more someone who's character driven. Like my characters in the novel I'm writing spoke to me first, more so than the universe that was happening. And so that's how I went about it. And then I had to really think of like, oh, well, what is the plot of this? What's going on? And that's because I'm not so much of an outliner. That's more like, I'm like, just fly by the seat of my pants and let's see what happens. So, yeah, so let's move on from there. So I'm going to go back into plot-driven stories are exciting and fast-paced. RJ gave a good example of like a thriller. They compel the readers to turn the page to find out how the characters escape, evade, prevail, or overcome the obstacles. You know, Octavia Butler's Kindred, no surprise that I like this one, and I've seen other people talk about it in this instance, is a time travel story where the choices rely on characters to move the story forward. So, with that, what are some plot-driven stories that come to mind for each of you? And I'm going to start off with Sameem this time.
I always blank. I guess I'm reading through the Expanse series right now, which like it is also character driven, but I think it's largely plot driven. I think it's a lot of what is happening in the universe around these characters that's driving things forward. And yeah, to a great extent, I guess like how the characters are responding to it. But that feels like pretty classic. Here's the next scenario that we're dealing with type of story. So I have a little bit of recency bias since I'm in the middle of the series right now.
No, but that's great because that like it's making you like think about like, well, what am I currently reading about it? So The Expanse, that's great. Gabe, what? I
mean, I'm blanking on a book, but I'm thinking of a TV series I recently watched, Blue Eye Samurai. Okay. I thought it was gonna be super character driven, but it is the root of it, but it's mostly plot driven. Just a revenge story. Just go and kill everyone and kill this fucker. So, and I think it could have been so much better. I mean, it is really good. I loved it very much. But I think personally, I gravitate so much to character. And I think this story in particular could have been spectacular if it was character driven. Comparing it to Arcane, in that similar vein, Arcane obviously it has an amazing plot, but it is so character driven that it's just incredible.
So I think of two is let's think about plot, right? And inserting when we've all seen this in certain books that it's glaring. This is a problem, and that's being when you have a token character. Whether it's like a female character, a person of color, a queer person, there's no nuance because that writer didn't do the work or is writing out of their spectrum, right? So to me, that can be like a very plot-driven formula, and to just have someone else in there who has no nuance. And I think we've all seen that in books and TV shows. I'm not going to point any out because I want to highlight the positive, but I think that's an easy way to see where, like, oh, this is a plot and this is where they didn't actually dig into the character too strongly. Marshall.
I sometimes think there are certain genres that are inherently plot driven, right? I think mysteries at the top for, like, in my mind right now. Gabe was mentioning a TV show. This one that just keeps popping into my head. I kind of want to rewatch it. I don't know if anybody watched Mayor of Easttown, but it's brilliant. The character Mayor, the main character, is fascinating, but things are kind of unfolding around her and she has to react to it. But because of the drive that the plot that is driving that mystery is what's keeping the story going, right? The character is in addition to it 100%. And the characters are very compelling. But again, it would just be this lady doing regular cop work if it wasn't for this overarching kind of mystery that was happening. Brilliant show, by the way, if you haven't watched it. Mare spelled Mare, because that's her nickname. It's really, really, really well done. But that's what comes to mind to me. I might come up with something else. People are ready to go, so go.
RJ, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to bring up genre, actually. Definitely, you beat me to it. Because the thing that came to mind for me, again, this is maybe recency biases, because I just read The Tainted Cup by Robert Jackson Bennett, which was really great. And it kind of combined, it's sort of like the 2-second pitch is like, well, it's in a fantasy world, but it's Attack on Titan meets Sherlock Holmes is the 2-second pitch. And so it's very actiony and, big kaiju style situation, but also mystery. So it's kind of thrillery and mystery, both of which are very plot oriented genres.
I love that. Sameem.
I was just going to throw out just for fun. I mean, I 100% agree with both what RJ and Marshall have said, but just another recency bias thing, but a fun, cozy mystery that I just read. Vera Wang's Unsolicited Advice for Murderers was, I thought, like, very character driven, but it's all like 100% a mystery. And I like the way that the author sort of both those two things around. But I do think maybe cozy mysteries are sort of an exception where character ends up being more important than the actual mystery.
For sure. So let's go into character-driven stories, where the plot is used to develop the character. Authors tend to put the focus on developing realistic, flawed human characters. Readers can see themselves in the characters as a result. As a result, it connects emotionally. An example for me, which again should be no surprise to anyone, is Adam Silvera's History Is All You Left Me. In the book, it's done in first-person point of view. Griffin lost his first love, an ex-boyfriend, Theo. It moves from the past of when they were dating to the present where they're broken up and then Theo has passed away. The only person that understands Griffin's heartache is Jackson, who was Theo's boyfriend up until he died. This is a book that really goes in the internal of the character's life and feelings in past, present, and the highs and lows of love. Like, this to me was really guided by the character's grief and also dealing with mental illness. And Griffin has OCD. And it comes together really beautifully. The whole entire, all of his flaws and his grief come really beautifully together at the end of the book, especially when it comes to having OCD. I thought it was done really well. Now, I'm going to ask you all, like, what are some character-driven stories that come to mind to you? And this time we'll start off with Marshall.
Oh, good. So I don't know why. Maybe it's because I've taught it so many times, But when I think of a character-driven story, I always think of, I think of two, but the first one that comes to mind is 1984. I don't know why. I don't know if anybody's read it recently, but that's whole story, there's this whole mechanism behind it, but that story would not unfold the way it does if Winston wasn't who he was. Winston like bucks the system and doesn't really know why. He's trying to fight against a basically the premise is if the Nazis had won World War II, what would the world look like, right? So it's this guy working in this job. He knows everything sucks, but he can't really do anything about it. But he starts to make little movements towards freedom. But as you read it, he's 100% lost. Like there's no way he can win this. And that's what drives the plot and drives the tension in the story. You know what I mean? So the framework is there, but really, if it was just that story would be different if that character was different. So that's kind of what I think about when I think of character-driven stories. I don't know why that always pops in my head first.
I love it. And I'll go with Gabe.
I mean, this will come as no surprise. Also, Greenbone Saga. It's such a character-driven story. Yeah, I mean, the plot is amazing, but you go so deep into characters. It's all the characters moving things, making things happen. And I think it is, it has an amazing plot, of course. I mean, it's amazing in all the three aspects. But for me, what hooked me and what has made me read it 8 times now, it's character. And I think it is a spectacular example of it. Characters as individuals, but also as all the interactions between characters, relationships. Oh my God, I've ranted about this so many times in the podcast. So, next.
RJ?
I've been on a big Ishiguro kick this year, and I read like 4 or 5 of his books. And along with what the genre thing we were talking about before, it's interesting. Marshall mentioned 1984. I'm mentioning Ishiguro, both of which are considered more literary, not genre. So there is that kind of expectation, maybe that literary fiction would be more on the character side as opposed to a thriller or mystery. But yeah, like in some of those books, like literally nothing happens. And it's amazing because it's all about like your perception of the character changing and the character's understanding of themselves changing. And like in Remains of the Day, like a butler goes on a 5-day like driving trip, which sounds like the most boringest thing you could possibly think of, but it was really freaking good. So that's mine.
I love it. Marshall?
I find it funny that you said nothing happens, RJ, and I feel you. But with my example with 1984, and if you haven't revisited it, it holds up. It's a classic, and it's definitely, alternate history style. I mean, you could argue there's genres in there, but really nothing happens. Nothing. I would argue nothing changes in the world. You know what I mean? The character, things happen, but like they're very subtle and nothing. And you realize as the reader at some point that nothing will change about this world, regardless of who that main character is, because the world is so set in what it is. You know what I mean? Which I find really fascinating. Like the character thinks things he's making a difference or that he can get out of there, but really he'd never had a chance. And it's heartbreaking, but also really, really says a lot for what a, authoritarian government could be, you know what I mean? Which I find pretty brilliant. Sorry, go ahead, RJ.
Yeah, I think like internal versus external might be another way of thinking about it. Like the changes in 1984 and in Ishiguro's books are in either internal or sort of in the reader's perception of the situation versus in a very plot-oriented story. things are happening on the page. Like the physical world is different, other characters are different, the whole situation is different by the end.
Sameem, what are some examples for you?
Well, first I wanted to respond to Marshall's 1984
Sure.
suggestion, because I hadn't thought about it that way, and I haven't read it since high school, so it's been like so long. But as you talked about it, I was like, oh, you're completely right, and those are all details that just didn't stay with me after all these years. Obviously, like the high concept part of the books stick with you, and I think that might be a really good example of like Orwell could have written that concept with any different type of character, and it could have gotten so many different ways. And it just kind of like, it goes back to our beginning conversation around like the conversation between the character you choose and the concept you choose will tell completely different stories. And I think that's just like a really, really good example of that. I was going to throw out another like literary fiction book. And then I realized that's what we've been talking about. So I guess I'll mention Ancillary Justice by Anne Leckie was one that I thought was really good. It's also very plot driven, but I thought that wasn't the point. For me, it wasn't the point. It was like this character finding out who they are and then telling the world who they are. And I felt like that drove the story way more for me than any other element.
I love that example. So let's go back to our plot-driven books each of us mentioned. How have these books affected your own writing? What did you learn from these books mentioned or thinking of looking at any plot-driven book? So think of your plot-driven book that you mentioned. How do you think that's influenced you, if at all, about how you go about plot? And maybe it's not the book you mentioned. Maybe there's another book that comes to mind that like, you know what, this plot was really great. I loved how they executed this, and this is what I would like to do in my work. Who would like to go first? Go right ahead, boss.
I knew you were going to say something like that. I don't know. I think my example was Mayor of Easttown, the show. But my next project is a mystery, and I really want it to be a kind of thriller mystery. But I've realized in making that happen, I really have to make the plot not just first, but I have to make that kind of the driving force behind the entire thing. Like, I feel like with my example, Mare's reacting to the things that are going on around her. She's trying to solve the case and deal with family stuff and stuff like that. But like, if those events hadn't happened, and again, with mystery, you have those beats that you're hitting, you know, as soon as someone dies, you got to figure out what the hell happened. Right. And so how does that affect the character? And I feel like if I can figure out how I want the plot to play out, the character stuff will kind of fall into place. You know?
I love that.
Yeah, I think I'm also writing a mystery that's also like the start of a space opera. I'm realizing more and more now. And I think I always thought about The Expanse, like the TV show, as a comp. And so now that I'm actually reading it, I think conceptually it still is, but I realize like from a writing style perspective, it's not. And maybe that's one way in which it's becoming instructive for me, is just learning about how I naturally tell a story versus thinking through how you structure both a mystery with a bunch of like sci-fi world building at the same time, and how you work out the pacing of all that information. And I mean, there's definitely chapters in The Expanse where I'm like, I'm going to skim through this, where it was like more exposition, or it was just like a really long like fight sequence that was like longer than I would do. So I was like, okay, I know I'm not going to do that, but I know what's going on. But it was still like knowing how to expose that information without it becoming too exposition-y has been something I've learned a ton.
Gabriel?
I'm thinking a lot right now about, like, from this conversation, about how plot and character are connected, if that makes sense. And I'm thinking about stakes, and also about the distinction of what defines a story being plot driven, what defines a story being character driven. Like when I was saying Green Bow Saga, Will made faces, which I interpreted.
I saw the faces as well.
In the sense that I think, Will, you were thinking that Greenbone is more plot driven, that has a big concept of plot driven versus character driven, but it made me think of the stakes. And I guess the more we understand the stakes, the more stakes we have, it can make it more character driven. I mean, I'm putting this out there, not that this is the way.
Sure, but what was your example for plot? When you mentioned plot, what did you mention? Green Bones, right?
No. For plot, it was Blue Eye Samurai.
Blue Eyed
TV
Samurai.
series.
What did you learn plot wise from Blue Eyed Samurai that you were like, you know what, this is a really great plot, and this is the way that I would want to structure maybe in my work?
Yeah, I mean, they lean into that plot. Like, they don't stray at all from that revenge story kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So this is what's going to happen no matter what. Like, it's not going to change. So I guess more than learning, it's I think I mentioned this the previous episode. More than learning what to do, it made me think of things not to do.
That's still learning
for the things that I like, because I gravitate to character stories so much. So yeah, it's more that learning what not to do.
I am doing a draft 0 of a novel right now, and I've reached kind of the ending quarter maybe or something like that, and I have to actually make the plot make sense. Or I have to tie things up. I have to put all the pieces that I've built up, and I am not an outliner, except I sat down and outlined from where I am to the end, because I was like, I need to get all this figured out. And I think part of what I don't know if I'd learned it from the Tainted Cup, but one thing that was exciting and interesting and inspirational from that was just having fun and like having big shit like explode, and like having, like there is something to be said for the like spectacle, and having characters, having the plot surprise you in ways, and having the way characters act surprise you in ways and that are satisfying based on the way the plot has built everything toward that end.
I love that. I mean, I would say for me, thinking of a plot, I mean, Kindred is an example, but you know what I really think about is me and Marshall read this together in one of our like older like writing groups that we were in, is And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. I think that is such a plot-driven novel, and what I loved about it, and it's a mystery, is the way things interconnected and played with each other, because there's not just like one villain in a way. And I thought that was a really ingenious way to go about a plot in a mystery. And it just made me think of like structure-wise of how you could do some interesting structures, because you can't really look at that through like a 3-act structure so much, or like a hero's journey structure. Like it's structured in a little bit of a different way. So that for me was one that I was really like, that is a really interesting concept, because I think with mysteries, yes, you're trying to get the mystery point, but the mysteries that deal with a detective or the main protagonist that is a series, I feel like you have to fall in love with the character, and the mystery is just kind of the side part, right? Even though you want the mystery to be solved and you're like super into it, it's the character and what they're going through is also something that's equally interesting when it comes to series. But plot-wise, I would definitely say And Then There Were None. Gabriel?
I mean, what you just said made me think that most, or at least the ones that I've read, most of Brandon Sanderson's books are heavily plot-driven, in the sense that, I mean, there's a term now, the Sanderstorm or Brandalanche, which is there's so much plot, so much build-up, so much stuff, and then the plot hits you, like in the climax, hits you like a train. And I think he does it really well, in a sense that he gives you enough character. There are some books that he gives you more character, but he gives you enough characters so that you care about the plot, and then he hits you with a plot like a train.
Interesting. Marshall?
Yeah, I agree, Gabe, and I've read most of Sanderson's stuff. But speaking of things that we've been reading recently, I've turned somebody on to an author recently, and I'm curious, Will. Old Man's War. Where does that fall in this conversation? I've recently turned Will on to Scalzi's, some of Scalzi's work, and it's brilliant. If you've never read John Scalzi's, especially his longer epics, sci-fi epics, Old Man's War, and I can't remember the name of the other series, but Emperors and a lot of the titles. But anyway, Starter Villain is great too. I read that when it came out. I love it. But where would Old Man's War fall in this conversation, Will? Because one of the things I like about Scalzi's work is his character work. But think of the framework and the plot that has to happen in order to make that work. So where I'm just curious, what would you think?
I mean,
I know now I'm asking you questions, but
no, it's okay. I would really say Old Man's War is plot driven, because I think he's having a conversation with Robert Heinlein, and Starship Troopers. So I think conceptually it's a really strong concept. But the thing that is really great about Scalzi is the characters in those books you really feel for. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like you really identify with what's the character's name in Old Man's War? I'm drawing a blank right now. I just read it too.
I read it way too long ago.
Yeah. But Harry, was it Harry?
It's something simple like that. Yeah.
So I don't even think it's Harry. It's something else probably. But
no, but it's something like that.
It was, seeing things through his eyes was really great way to immerse yourself. I also think what I learned about that book is you're dealing with these high concepts, right? About interstellar travel, because he does kind of touch upon the physics of things, but it's all funneled through the characters' observations. And I think what Scalzi does right is he has a really humanizing quality to his science fiction. The Interplanetary series that I'm reading now with him, which is a 3-book saga, is definitely plot driven again. But what he does so really well, and this is why I think one is no greater than the other, right? To really make a good book, you do have to have both. It's the way that the characters come through that is just really genius. So I'm really obsessed with him right now.
You're welcome.
I'm literally on the 6th book of his. So yeah.
I mean, just to continue the conversation of what would you guys think about how they might shift within a series. Maybe the first book, maybe more character driven, and then you get more plot driven as they do you have any example that you might think that it shifts as it goes?
I think here's where I think it gets interesting is because with something if we go back to the Sanderson thing, sure, that's plot driven. But he's bouncing POVs the entire time. We are invested in those characters. So as the series goes on, it's hard to think about his books and later in the series as plot driven, mostly because you're so invested in the characters. So I don't know if it necessarily changes, but as a reader, if you can, as a writer, if you can do that for the reader, I think that's a really interesting way to kind of continue to blur the lines we're still having a hard time kind of articulating. You know what I'm saying? I don't know if that makes sense. What were you gonna say, Will?
We'll have Sameem go first.
Okay.
It's been a minute since I've read the Broken Earth trilogy, but that's one where in my mind, I could be totally wrong in this, but from my memory, I feel like the first book was way more character driven. But the subsequent books became much more plot driven, I think especially by the third book. That could just be the way I'm remembering it, but I felt like it became much more about what is going on in the broader environment and system and the history by the third book, whereas the first book was how did this character come to be the person that she is.
Yeah, I actually agree with you. I think too, it's the way the story's being told in the first one specifically that really gives it that character-driven feel, where the other two definitely feel like it's very much the plot is kind of driving things. As far as Sanderson, I'm just going to touch on this, and then I want to go to the other one. Is I only read his Mistborn books, and I think the first 3 Mistborns, the original ones, are much more plot-driven, where I do think the next ones have a really great plot, but it's those characters I really fell in love with.
Yeah.
Where I have tried to get into his Stormlight Archive book, but I'm just not there yet. But also, just as a caveat, I'm not so much into epic fantasy unless it's like, I don't know, not Western maybe, but that's food for thought. But I want to move on for a minute because I want us to talk about, it's the same question for character-driven books. The books that you mentioned for character-driven books, how have they affected your own writing? And what did you learn from those books that you mentioned, or thinking about, like any character-driven book? What do you want to intake for that for your books? And we'll start with RJ with this one.
I learned a lot from Ishiguro's writing, the novels that I read of his so far. And also, I had meant to mention this when we were talking about genre as well, but like some of his books are considered Gothic. And I think that as a subgenre is another one that is very character focused. And I think I learned from that subgenre more about unreliable narrators or how people get so deep in their own head that they can't see what's going on. But the reader can, and how that can build suspense and tension, and how satisfying or moving it can be to have that sort of bubble that a character has built around themselves break, and the reality that the readers have understood throughout the book kind of burst through. So I've been using that kind of movement in the story that I'm working on.
That's awesome. Sameem?
I'm gonna switch the book that I'm thinking about, because another book I read recently that I think was more instructive in some ways for me was A Place for Us by Fatima Farin Mirza, because it's like a multi-generational like viewpoint story, and it's non-linear. It hops around timeline a lot and viewpoint a lot, and I think that was really instructive for me in a lot of ways, but also like a reminder, because I'm the book I'm writing right now is, because it's a mystery, I was really focused on the linearity of the plot and the causal, like here's what's going on and how to tell that story. And it's really antithetical to how I usually write, and my short stories demonstrate this. I don't always write in a very linear way. And it kind of forced me to think about, well, how do I bring that back in? Once I've established the sort of core mystery, how do I figure out how to tell the story the way that I really want to tell it, and merge those things together?
I love that. Marshall?
I don't know. I feel like if we had this conversation a couple of months ago before I started teaching again, I think I'd really be away from the literary fiction examples. But I'm kind of immersed in that right now, and I'm realizing how much I kind of pull from some of that stuff. So essentially the question is, what have I learned from the character-driven stories, right? So with 1984 as my example I gave earlier, I've realized that, especially since one of the stories I'm writing right now is first-person POV, and sometimes POV really skews how this goes too, but with something like 1984 and some of the other examples in my head, I put in the chat while RJ was talking, when she said something about Gothic fiction, Edgar Allan Poe's Telltale Heart came to mind as well. It's something about the lens of the world that you're seeing through the character's eyes that I really wish I could pull off a little bit more with some of my genre stuff. So, for example, like I said, Winston in 1984 is seeing the world in a very specific way that he can't quite understand yet, but he knows he doesn't have the control over his life that he wants, and he's looking to do that, right? And then what happens if the character is going through a crisis or trauma or mentally unstable in some way too? Like so I find that really interesting. I want to be able to pull that off more. So as far as what I've learned that who's telling the story skews how the story can be told, and I want to get better with my, especially in my genre stuff. I want to get better at that. So what I've learned is the lens, trying to get more into the character's head and the lens of the telling the story, which is why I like some of Scalzi's work so much too, because sometimes whoever's POV is in that chapter, you're like, holy crap, they're really looking at this world in a way that these other people don't see. And I find that really fascinating. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. Gabe?
I'm switching my answer too, both because I've talked a lot about Greenbone Saga and because I put it in the chat, Avatar: The Last Airbender. Like, more than learning, which, yeah, I've literally watched it dozens of times, watched hundreds of hours of analysis, and it all comes down to character. And it's just the inspiration of trying to pull off that. Like for Ang, it's so deeply personal. It's insane. Like within, I don't know, it's the second to last episode, when he is trying to figure out what to do, nothing happens that episode, basically. It's just him figuring out what to do. And it is so incredible, and you're so invested in the characters. And obviously, I mean, probably most people have watched that series, but Zuko's arc, Toph, like all of them, it is so deeply personal for all of the characters, even secondary characters. Oh my god, yeah, it's just the inspiration to be able to pull that off. That is what drives me also. When I watch it again, when I see a new video of Avatar, it just pushes me, like, I mean, to strive for that. More than learning specific things, which I have, it's just the motivation to pull something like that off.
I love that. I would say for me, History Is All You Left Me actually made me help write my play. Because I think my play is all about these characters in different stages of grief and asking important questions. And internally, we see all of the characters change or come to a place of acceptance, I think. And I think what I also learned, just like in the book, History Is All You Left Me, I think I left the play very open-ended. Nothing was just like simply tied in a bow and like, oh, well, I'm no longer in grief. And I don't think the book was really like that either. I think what you did see is in the book, and hopefully in my play, these characters kind of coming to terms as far as, what death has brought to them. So this was a really fun conversation. So I hope everyone who's listening enjoys, and think of what are your favorite character-driven stories or your plot-driven stories, and tell us in our Discord, because you can join it. And if you're listening to this and you're already in our Discord, I expect some feedback in there. And before we sign off, RJ, could you tell people where they could find you?
You can find me. The easiest thing to do is just go to my website. Rebecca, that's not my name. rjtaylorauthor.com. And it'll have my latest stories and things on there.
And we will put a link to that in the show notes.
Absolutely. Thanks for being here, RJ. It was awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me.
And this has been Just Keep Writing, a podcast for writers, by writers, to keep you writing. You can find us at justkeepwriting.org. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Feel free to reach out to any of us on our social medias, and please jump in our Just Keep Writing Discord channel. Links to all of that is in the show notes. Lastly, please support our show by going to patreon.com/justkeepwriting. We offer daily writing prompts, early access to podcast episodes, and much more. Thanks for listening, and just keep writing.